Today we're going to talk about gluconeogenesis. Is your body turning that steak into cake? I'll see you inside. So, gluconeogenesis is the process of making new glucose. And just the word itself actually gives this all away. Gluco meaning glucose, neo meaning new, and genesis meaning to create. And this is a pathway by which we make glucose from what are referred to as non-hexose precursors. And these are basically things that are not glucose or carbohydrate, and these include glycerol, lactate, pyruvate, and gluconeogenic amino acids. And the reason we do this is because there are organs like the brain, the eye, and the kidney that have tissues in them that can only use glucose as fuel. And if we get depleted in glucose, we need to create more glucose endogenously to make sure that we still have enough glucose for these organs. And yes, even if you are the most ketogenic adapted person in the world, you're still going to be creating glucose to fuel these organs. While it is true that people who have been on a ketogenic diet can supply their brain about 75 to 80% of its fuel through ketones. And the longer and more advanced you are, the better you are at creating fuel out of ketones and using that as your predominant fuel source. However, notice I said 75% to 80%. This simply will not get up to 100% because there are certain cell types in the brain that require glucose. So people who are on a ketogenic diet will still actually be making glucose through gluconeogenesis, even if they do not ingest a single gram of carbohydrates. And gluconeogenesis is essentially the reversal of glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose. Because we are doing the opposite, we are actually creating glucose. And now, while these processes aren't actually necessary to know and can sound kind of trivial, I'll just list them out just in case you're interested. So we start in the mitochondria, where pyruvate goes through what's called carboxylation, and this turns pyruvate into oxaloacetate. Interestingly, this process actually requires biotin. Then, in the cytosol, oxaloacetate goes through what's called decarboxylation, and it is rearranged to form what's called phosphoenol pyruvate, or PEP. Interestingly, this process actually requires magnesium. So then this PEP molecule goes through what's called hydration to form 2-phosphoglycerate. And then 2-phosphoglycerate converts into 3-phosphoglycerate. This molecule goes through what's called phosphorylation to form 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And reduction is gaining an electron. And glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate goes through isomerization to form dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And then another molecule of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is combined with dihydroxyacetone phosphate to form fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate goes through dephosphorylation to form fructose 6-phosphate. And fructose 6-phosphate converts into glucose 6-phosphate, which is very important. So glucose 6-phosphate becomes dephosphorylated to form glucose, and the glucose can freely enter the bloodstream. Okay, now that we kind of have the biochemistry out of the way, how do we get the substrate to start this whole reaction? These substrate are lactate, glycerol, and gluconeogenic amino acids. So first, let's talk about glycerol. And glycerol actually comes from adipose tissue. So we break down what are called triglycerides from adipose tissue, and 3 fatty acids come from it and a glycerol molecule. So a triglyceride is actually one glycerol molecule with 3 fatty acids attached. The free fatty acids can actually circulate in our bloodstream and be used for energy. The glycerol goes to the liver and is phosphorylated by an enzyme called glycerol kinase to make glycerol phosphate. And then the glycerol phosphate goes through what's called dehydrogenation, and it makes dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which is something that can enter this gluconeogenic cycle. So earlier I mentioned glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, but this dihydroxyacetone phosphate can actually be used as a replacement. And what's interesting is that it can simply just enter as dihydroxyphosphate and then go through the only 4 remaining steps instead of starting all the way down at pyruvate. So the next thing we'll talk about is lactate, which is actually a product of anaerobic glycolysis. And this is simply when you're working your muscles and there's not enough oxygen to supply all of the energy for the working muscles. Or in cases of cells that actually don't have a mitochondria, so they can't go through the oxidative process, so they just rely on this anaerobic glycolysis all the time to meet all of their energy needs. And this process generates lactate, and the lactate goes to the liver, where it can actually be converted to glucose through the gluconeogenesis. Interestingly, glucose is released into the bloodstream where it goes back to the working muscle and is broken down again by anaerobic glycolysis, forming lactate. And then this lactate once again travels back to the liver and becomes glucose, and glucose forms lactate, and this process goes over and over and over. And this is referred to as the Cori cycle. And now the final thing that I want to talk about are amino acids, and this is where the theory of your steak turning into cake, or protein or amino acids turning into glucose instead of being used for muscle tissue. So the specific amino acids are gluconeogenic amino acids. And they are actually broken down into different metabolites such as fumarate, alpha-ketoglutarate, and succinyl-CoA. And these metabolites are actually used in glycolysis, or the breakdown of glucose. And in the process of actually going through glycolysis, these specific metabolites are converted into oxaloacetate, which, as you might remember by going through the chemistry beforehand, oxaloacetate is actually the first molecule that is formed in the mitochondria using pyruvate. So this oxaloacetate simply just goes through the rest of gluconeogenesis and creates glucose. And now, what regulates gluconeogenesis? It actually seems to be the levels of a hormone called glucagon, the availability of all of these substrates, and the production of things like catecholamines and cortisol. So glucagon is actually produced in the alpha cells of the pancreas when our blood glucose, or the glucose in our bloodstream, begins to lower, and it regulates glucose production by altering the activity of glycolytic, meaning glucose breaking down, and gluconeogenic, building up glucose, enzymes. Simply, it increases the amount of gluconeogenic enzymes and decreases the amount of glycolytic enzymes. And now, something that will actually inhibit gluconeogenesis is insulin, because insulin is a response to an increase in blood sugar levels. Blood sugar and blood glucose can be used interchangeably. So if I say blood sugar, I mean blood glucose. And when we aren't eating, we will have very, very low insulin levels. Therefore, it's almost like the low insulin levels are allowing gluconeogenesis to happen. And lower insulin actually allows for us to break down more fat and protein, which leads to more availability of that substrate. And now let's kind of look at this. So let's say we're doing a fast. In the first 18 to 24 hours, most of the gluconeogenesis occurs in the liver. But following a prolonged period of time not eating, the kidneys will actually adapt and generate about 20% of our total glucose. And it's only these two organs that can actually create glucose. So if we come back to the idea of needing enough substrate, if we are eating a very low carbohydrate diet, we actually provide the body with all the substrate it needs to go through gluconeogenesis more often. So if we're actually eating sufficient carbohydrates, we likely won't go through gluconeogenesis very often because we're eating enough exogenous carbohydrates to already have the glucose available. However, let's say we're following a very low carbohydrate diet. There certainly is a reason to go through gluconeogenesis because we're not eating exogenous glucose, or much of it. So if we didn't go through gluconeogenesis, our blood glucose levels would fall to a dangerous level and we wouldn't have enough glucose to supply our tissues that require it. But we're supplying all this fuel through triglycerides and amino acids through our protein that we will upregulate the process of gluconeogenesis because we have more than enough substrate to do so. And now the reason why people fear eating a lot of protein on a ketogenic diet is because they fear that providing their body with excess substrate will in turn cause much more glucose production. And the reason people follow a low carbohydrate diet is to keep their blood glucose levels lower so that they do not increase their insulin levels. So it's almost like if you eat an abundance of protein, it's almost like eating a different form of carbohydrates. And while it is true that if you eat a lot of protein, this process will occur, you will likely acutely have an increase in blood glucose. Because once the body has used the amino acids for things like building muscle, the remaining amino acids will likely be turned into glucose and put into the bloodstream. And then if the glucose in the bloodstream isn't used, then this glucose will go into fat storage. But even if you ate an only fat diet, you would still use the glycerol backbones from all of the triglycerides that you're eating to go through gluconeogenesis. However, fat doesn't actually require the step of being turned into glucose before it can be turned into fat. So even if you eat a preponderance of fat, if you eat a very low protein and very low carbohydrate diet, you likely won't ever see a very large increase in your blood sugar. Simply the body isn't going to take the fat, turn it into glucose, and then turn it back into fat for storage. Whereas protein, it will first be turned into glucose, and then this glucose will be turned into fat and put into storage. Therefore, technically, once again, if you eat a very, very large amount of protein at one time, you will likely have an upregulation of glucose production because you have sufficient substrate to go through gluconeogenesis. And then if that glucose is not used, then it will then be turned into fat and stored in fat cells. But sometimes this is extremely beneficial. As contrary as it might sound, insulin is a very beneficial hormone as long as it's not around too often and in too high of a quantity. Insulin has very important roles in promoting muscle building, cellular hydration, and even helping increase brain function. So if you do want to follow a very low carbohydrate diet, maybe having an abundance of protein in a single meal every once in a while is actually going to be a beneficial thing because it will purposefully increase our blood glucose and increase our insulin. And as long as you don't do this chronically over time and develop something called insulin resistance, which is a process where you have so much insulin around so often that your cells actually reduce the amount of insulin receptors on the membrane so that all this insulin isn't constantly bombarding the cell. But this process will typically occur if you're eating a very high carbohydrate diet for a very long period of time. But let's say we're following a low carbohydrate diet or even a normal carbohydrate diet and we eat an abundance of protein. It will also help increase our insulin levels, which can assist us in building muscle and help in cellular hydration and the cognitive benefits I mentioned. But this might be beneficial because some people are actually following a low carbohydrate diet because they're trying to avoid specific foods that give them intestinal issues or even cognitive issues. So as terrible as it sounds, we can use a steak as a very expensive source of carbohydrates. Now, small boluses of protein likely won't have this big effect of raising our blood sugar, but it will help increase gluconeogenesis to keep our blood sugar levels stable. But it definitely is true that if you eat a very large amount of protein in a singular meal, you could potentially be turning your steak into cake. And I hope this was interesting, and I hope you took something away from it. Maybe you learned something, and maybe you kind of have a different perspective on how to orient your meals in terms of protein, fats, and carbohydrates. It also may clear up some things of how your body actually functions and how the body is able to maintain glucose and proper functioning even if you completely remove it from your diet. With that being said, I think I'm going to wrap this one up here. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you listen to the next episode. If you would like to follow me anywhere on social media or read any of my writings, you can find all of that in the description of this podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Calvin_Scheller, and I will see you next episode. Thank you for listening.